Behind me is the engine house at Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is used to be in Virginia. Now it's in West Virginia at the confluence of the Potomac River and the Shenandoah River. The In 1859, this engine house was a combination of a fire engine house and a guardhouse for the U.S. Army Arsenal, which was located at Harper's Ferry. In October 1859, the abolitionist John Brown came boiling down from the Maryland side of the Potomac River and captured Harper's Ferry and captured the armory there with the intention of arming enslaved Americans to create sort of a titanic slave rebellion that was supposed to occur from along the fringe of the Blue Ridge Mountain, and then with sort of raids on into the interior of Virginia. The raid really came to nothing. John Brown and his followers were soon set upon by Virginia militia and then by Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was then in the Army but was on extended leave in Washington, and given command of these Marines to come take care of John Brown. And within a few days, Brown and his followers were either killed or captured. Brown himself was captured. He was tried for treason against Virginia, which seems kind of an odd thing to try him for. And just a few months later, December 2nd, 1859, was hanged at the county seat of Charlestown, again in present day West Virginia. So today I want to talk about abolitionism and anti-slavery, these two movements that, as with so many other things in American life, took a militant turn in the years leading up to the American Civil War. But we're going to look now at these movements in their earlier stages. And again, these movements gave gestation, so to speak, to John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry, and before that, a sort of a campaign of terrorism and counterterrorism in an area called Bleeding, Kansas, which was then a territory, as we're going to see, was a territory that the United States government said, "Hey, if you settlers want to have slavery, you can have slavery. If you don't want to have slavery, you can not have slavery. It's up to you." And Americans fought back and forth, over whether Kansas was going to be a slave state or a free state. About 75 Americans, both pro-slavery and anti-slavery, were killed during this period known as Bleeding, Kansas. So we're talking about the issue of slavery, that Americans eventually proved unable to solve peacefully. And that led first to the violence in Bleeding, Kansas, and then the violence of John Brown's raid in October 1859, and then ultimately to the American Civil War. Well, let's look at the early stages of American concern about slavery and the idea of removing slavery from American society and the various forms in which that movement took. This movement, this anti-slavery and abolitionist movement, took place in the context of a larger program of reform movements that we're also going to be looking at this week. Reform movements that had to do with religious revivalism, that had to do with an anti-alcohol movement called the temperance movement, that had to do with prison reforms and the creation of humane institutions for those who were mentally ill or who were blind or deaf, and so forth. So we're dealing with a period of reform that occurs simultaneously with the emergence of the white man's democracy, as we call it, and also to the market revolution. These all occur at the same time. Let me share the screen with you. Okay. Here are the terms, and of course they're in PDF format already in the module. So let's get started right in. The Declaration of Independence not only declared the colonies free of Great Britain, but it also helped to inspire Vermont to abolish slavery in its 1777 state Constitution. By 1804, all northern states had voted to abolish the institution of slavery within their borders. In most of these states, however, emancipation was not immediate. Instead, gradual emancipation um, laws were passed, and these set deadlines in terms of the period in which all slaves would be freed, releasing individuals as they reached a certain age um, or at the end of a certain work period. And this situation left some enslaved African Americans in lingering in bonded servitude. In fact, in New York, which had a gradual emancipation law, there were a handful of African Americans living in that state who were still enslaved at the time of the American Civil War. In 1799, though, the state overall passed a gradual Emancipation Act that freed slave children born after July 4th, 1799, but indentured them, that is to say, sort of put them in forced apprenticeships until they reached the age of 21. In 1817, a new law was passed that would free slaves born before 1799, but not until 1827. Connecticut also passed a gradual abolition act in 1784, but this act did not emancipate any enslaved persons, only those born into slavery afterward, and only after they reached the age of 25. Now, this gradual process meant that slavery in Connecticut did not officially end until 1848, long after many other northern states had abolished the practice. And only in Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire was slavery abolished outright. And I could go down the line. I could talk about how things worked out in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, which was the last state in the North to pass a law in abolishing slavery. This occurred only in 1804. So even in the North, you did not have kind of a full throated um, movement against slavery in the sense um, of just immediate emancipation, and certainly not in the ultimate abolitionist sense of emancipation, which was to say freedom for enslaved Americans, followed immediately by um, political, social, and economic equality as a moral imperative. So there are other anti-slavery movements, but only the abolitionists believed in immediate, uncompensated emancipation as a moral imperative. By I mean uncompensated, I mean no payments made to the owners in compensation for the loss of their slaves. So immediate, uncompensated emancipation as a moral imperative, followed by political, social, and economic equality, certainly equality of opportunity. Then, if we look to the west, we see that in the old Northwest Territory, slavery was prohibited by the Ordinance of 1787. But by way of reminder, this was not a humanitarian measure. This was intended to make sure that the old Northwest Territory was going to be open to labor by white people who were not going to have to compete with slave labor. In Ohio, if you were a free black and wanted to enter Ohio, you had to put up a $500 bond. In Indiana, immigration by African Americans was prohibited by law altogether. Now, in terms of the American South, slavery remained legal in Delaware and then Maryland and then all states to the south of that. After the American Revolution, though, some Southern slaveholders became ambivalent about slavery. On the one hand, it seemed out of keeping with the ideals of the Revolution. And on the other, the South was a slave-holding society. In the North, that was a society that had slaves. And from an economic standpoint, slavery was not central um, to the sort of the healthy running or successful running of their economy. In the South, the elimination of slavery would have brought real economic turmoil and problems. Nevertheless, slaveholders were often really conflicted about the persistence of slavery within their states. So, what do you do about this? Well, although state legislatures rejected emancipation, they made it easier, though, for owners to free their own slaves if they chose to do so without government approval. They could just do it as private citizens. The 1782 Virginia statute was typical. It required owners to provide support for slaves under 18 years of age or over 45 years of age, just so not we're not going to throw children out into conditions where they can't take care of themselves, or where if they're over 45 they're not capable any longer physically and so forth to take care of themselves. Imagine 45 years old being an age at which, if you were enslaved, you were effectively an old person. That's how hard your laboring life had been. And so Thomas Jefferson himself, that's the figure on the left, epitomized this ambivalence. On the one hand, he recognized slavery as a moral evil. He said, there must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, slaves who are children, gives a loose to his worst of passions, his child unleashing the worst of his passions upon other children who happen to be enslaved, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped by it with its odious peculiarities. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. And this, by the way, is an argument that can be made concerning racism, sexism, other forms of discrimination today, that it not only harms the person who is discriminated against, it also harms the person who does the discrimination. So that in terms of, say, sexism, to give one example, ultimately, this ideology hurts men as much as it does women, just in an indirect kind of way. This is something that too often gets lost in these kinds of discussions that sort of create things in terms of, the oppressor is identified and is condemned, so forth, and then the oppressed is considered to be like universally virtuous. I think a better way to look at it is, prejudice, racism, whatever, or sexism, whatever you want to call it, hurts everybody. It hurts all of us. It impoverishes our lives. In his will, this is looking at the picture on the right. This is George Washington. He's about to pass away. In his will, George Washington left directions for the eventual emancipation of his slaves after the passing of his wife, Martha Washington. So she would have the benefit of their labor during her lifetime, and then the slaves on his plantation, Mount Vernon, would be freed. As far as Jefferson was concerned, though, he manumitted only the 5 young children of Sally Hemings. And it used to be kind of a rumor, sort of a that that Jefferson was the father of these children, that he had had sex with Sally Hemings, and indeed considered Sally Hemings almost a kind of a spouse. Um, and in recent years, because of DNA evidence and other kinds of things, it's become established, with really without doubt, that this relationship between Sally Hemings and Jefferson existed, and that it did produce children. And when you go to Monticello, his estate today, um, those who do demonstrate, or sorry, who have exhibits, have created exhibits concerning Monticello, accept this relationship between Jefferson and Sally Hemings as a historical fact. Whereas when I first visited Monticello back in 1972, they stayed far away from it, as far away from this issue as they could. So Jefferson ends up manumitting upon his death only the five young children of Sally Hemings, who were quite likely his own children, and then two other slaves. So manumission, though, is one way in which um, slavery could be ended. It could be ended by an individual owner, liberating individual enslaved persons. Well, what if you're going to do this on a larger scale? Well, that gets us into the American Colonization Society, founded in 1816. The American Colonization Society was founded by groups who were otherwise opposed to each other on the issue of slavery. It was a coalition made up mostly of evangelical Christians and Quakers who supported the abolition of slavery and believed that African Americans would face better chances for freedom in Africa than in the United States. And then some slaveholders in the Maryland branch of the organization and elsewhere, who saw repatriation as a way to remove free blacks from slave societies and avoid slave rebellion. So it's really out of their own enlightened self interest that they supported colonization. The society also attracted numerous prominent supporters from the Virginia Piedmont region, that is to say, the region of Virginia that was above the fall line, so sort of basically a strip of land in central Virginia. And these two opposed groups that disagreed about a lot. Some believed in abolition, some didn't believe in abolition, but believed for different reasons it'd be a good idea to remove enslaved persons. These found common ground in the form of what was called repatriation. The society included American presidents Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, James Madison, all of them Virginians. James Madison served as the organization's president in the early 1830s. Now, the Republic of Liberia, which exists today, began as a settlement of the American Colonization Society, who believed, again, that Black people would face better chances for freedom in Africa than in the United States. And between January 7th, 1822, and then the American Civil War, more than 15,000 freed, liberated, former enslaved persons, and freeborn Black people who faced legislative limits in the United States on the amount of freedom that they enjoyed. They went to Liberia, and then almost 3,200 Afro-Caribbeans, which is to say people living in the West Indies, Cuba, and so forth. The capital of Liberia was named Monrovia after James Monroe. It's Monrovia down to this day. Um, Liberia ultimately declared its independence, became its own independent nation, July 26th, 1847. The United Kingdom was the first country to recognize Liberia's independence. The United States did not recognize Liberia's independence, though, until February 5th, 1862. That is to say, the Civil War had been underway for almost a year. Finally got around to that. So you have manumission, you have the American Colonization Society, then what? You have the American Anti-Slavery Society. This was founded in 1833, and this was the first abolitionist organization. By abolitionism, I mean, and this is important, I mean immediate, uncompensated emancipation as a moral imperative, followed by political, social, and economic equality, or equality of economic the pursuit of economic independence. Okay. Um, this organization was founded by William Lloyd Garrison. We're going to encounter him, another man, Arthur Tappan, who we don't have to worry about so much, but William Lloyd Garrison is an important figure. Frederick Douglass, who we're going to be dealing with a lot, who was an escaped slave. He became a key leader in this society and often spoke at its meetings. By 1838, so just 5 years after its creation, this society had 1,350 local charters with around 250,000 members. In 1840, the organization, though, split, partly over the admission of women into the society and partly over tactics. How are we going to bring about abolition? Many of those who left the organization favored doing, pursuing abolition through uh, ordinary political activities, and they founded what's called the Liberty political party. Before we go on, I want you to look at this illustration that the American Anti-Slavery Society frequently used. It is an enslaved man in chains, sort of pleading for liberation, and the slogan at the bottom says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And there are 2 points to be made here. First, you see, in effect, this helpless slave, asking for help from, almost by definition, white people, although you have some African Americans involved, men and women, prominently, including Frederick Douglass. But the operative point is this person is helpless. This person, can do nothing to achieve their own freedom. This is not really the case. You had slaves who escaped from their plantations, fugitive slaves. You had a few slave uprisings, most prominently Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. We're going to look at that. And then, in terms of where the United States ultimately comes down on this question of am I not a man and a brother, I would say that even after the American Civil War, the response was you're a man, but you're not a brother. You know, you're a man. You have legal rights. Maybe in the South you have political rights and so forth, but you're not a brother. You're not a full member of American society. You do not count as much as the white majority. Now, I talked about William Lloyd Garrison before. That's William Lloyd Garrison, photograph there. And he was the founder of an abolitionist newspaper. It's called The Liberator, founded in 1831. And he was, very militant in his language and unbending. And in the first issue of The Liberator, he said something really very famous. "I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." The Liberator was not the only abolitionist newspaper in the country. And one of the things I think that helped abolitionists sort of get in touch with one another and recognize one another was that, you had a multiplicity of abolitionist newspapers, you know, published by people who initially might have been out of touch with one another or only tenuously aware of the other's existence. So these abolitionist newspapers also helped to create a kind of a network of people who recognized one another and banded together. I wouldn't want to push this analogy too far, but it is a little bit similar to the impact of social media today, where people who don't know one another or think of themselves as like, I'm an individual, I only know a few people like myself, suddenly discover that across the country there are thousands of people like themselves, and they are able to band together for better or worse as a result. Frederick Douglass, whose narrative is the first of several autobiographies that he published during his lifetime. We're going to look very closely at him. He was the most famous of numerous African Americans, both free, black, and escaped slaves, who joined the abolitionist movement. His narrative, published in 1845, this was 10 years after his escape in 1835, and then of course, some years after his birth in 1818. His narrative was considered to be of such high literary quality, and he really is one of the best American writers ever. Was considered to be of such high literary quality that many objected it could not possibly have been written by an African American. And indeed, it really is a remarkable achievement, given that Douglass, for all practical purposes, taught himself to read and write. As you'll see when you read his narrative, he did have some assistance in the early stages, but in terms of achieving a real command of the English language, that is a testimony to his remarkable intelligence, his perseverance, and just simply his literary gifts. You'll notice that in 1847, he founded his own abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. And this was named because when slaves left the plantation, they headed, north to freedom. They knew that freedom lay somewhere to the north, and they moved mostly at night for reasons of safety. And their guide was the North Star, Polaris, Star Polaris. So that's where the title of the abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, comes from. Douglass eventually became a critic not only of slavery, but also of the implicit and sometimes explicit racism that he perceived among Northern abolitionists. That, on the one hand, these people favored the immediate uncompensated emancipation for African Americans who were enslaved, but at the same time, he could tell that there was a certain moral superiority that they felt, and a certain condescension, and a certain idea that they were grown-ups, and these enslaved people were in some sense children. And this was something that Douglass spoke out against as well. Now, what's going on in the political sphere during this time? Well, Congress, the U.S. Congress, understood very clearly that it was a bad idea to let slavery intrude into American life. As we're going to see, every time that slavery did intrude into national political life, is what I want to say, it created problems. Most notably in the Missouri crisis of 1820. That resulted in the Missouri Compromise. We'll look at that down the line. And in order to keep slavery out of federal politics, the U.S. Congress passed something called the gag rule. Passed it in 1836, because what was happening was that Americans have a constitutional right to petition their government for for the I'm thinking of the to petition their government for redress of grievances. Redress was the term I was missing there. And under using this constitutional right to petition their government for redress of grievances, petitions of various kinds began to pour into the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate, praying for the abolition or the of slavery, or the restriction of slavery within the United States. And these petitions were generally presented by John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams and a former president who then became a member of a congressman in the House of Representatives. And he presented them in Congress, not so much because he was a vociferous abolitionist, he really wasn't, but because he was a great believer in the the right of the people to petition their government for redress of grievances. So he's more than happy to present these petitions when they were received. Well, the pro-slavery forces in the U.S. Congress responded with a series of gag rules beginning in 1836 that automatically tabled all such petitions. In other words, they would be received, and then under the parliamentary rules of the House of Representatives, as the slaveholding states insisted upon them, these petitions would be received, and then they would be tabled, which means that they would be set aside without being discussed or even being read to the House of Representatives. Uh, in January 1840, the House of Representatives passed something it called the 21st Rule, which prohibited even the reception of anti-slavery petitions, and this became a standing House rule for the next several years. And it wasn't finally rescinded until 1844, and this was because John Quincy Adams used numerous parliamentary procedures uh, in order to make this happen. You know, Congress operates under something similar to Robert's Rules of Order. These orders, have a lot of rules involved with them. If you're good at parliamentary procedure, at understanding these rules of order, you can kind of sort of get what you want. Adams became a master at this in order to get certain elements of this gag rule set aside. But again, the bottom line in all this is the gag rule existed to keep slavery and questions of slavery and anti-slavery out of the sphere of national government for fear that protracted discussion or any discussion about this issue would tend to tear the Union apart. There were also numerous literary attempts to dramatize the evils of slavery. And by far the most famous of these was Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it was published in serial form. Let's say, published in a magazine issue. Like, this issue had one episode from it, and this issue had the next, and this issue had the next, and so forth until the whole thing was, came out sort of like a television miniseries would be nowadays. Finally came out as a book, 1852, and Beecher Stowe was the sister of several prominent abolitionists, particularly Henry Ward Beecher, who, among other activities, purchased muskets for anti-slavery settlers in Kansas, Kansas Territory, we call Bleeding Kansas, and these muskets were known as Beecher's Bibles. Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 300,000 copies in the United States during its first year and over 1 million copies in Great Britain. Much of its power owed to its depiction of slavery as destructive to families, because most Northerners could relate to families. And the illustration that you're looking at on the right shows the slave Eliza escaping with her only child across the ice floes, FLOES, of the Ohio River to reach safety on the Ohio side of the river. So the these slave catchers or these upset owners are on the Kentucky side, and then she is making her way across an awfully narrow Ohio River to safety. But the fictional Eliza, who was able to save her child, did not always have a counterpart in real life. And I want to end this presentation by showing you this illustration of Margaret Garner in Cincinnati in 1856. And this is an episode that really occurred. She was a fugitive slave. Margaret Garner was. She was living in Cincinnati. She was located by agents for her owner in the South. And by this time, she had a 2-year-old daughter, and a question arose as to whether she should be tried in Ohio as a person or immediately returned to slavery under the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which is a federal law that overrode personal liberty laws passed by states that allowed due process, that set up a system of due process for um, people who were, in fact, accused of being a fugitive slave. These laws basically said, well, if you think this person is your slave, you need to prove it to the satisfaction of this court. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a federal law insisted upon by Southern slaveholders to override these personal liberty laws. So when you hear that the Civil War was about states' rights and the South stood up for states' rights and so forth, well, it stood up for states' rights when it worked in their favor, and they were all in favor of federal law trumping states' rights when that worked to their favor. So when it became clear that she was going to be returned to slavery, she killed her own 2-year-old daughter with a butcher knife rather than see her daughter returned to slavery. And this horrifying, event created a tremendous gained a tremendous amount of attention in the United States, particularly in the North, with some being appalled that a mother could kill her own child for any reason, and then others feeling like, my God, what a horror slavery must be, enslavement must be, if a mother would kill her own infant child rather than subject her child to that kind of life. Now, the abolitionists did a great deal to bring the evil of slavery to popular awareness, but they were resented in the North as well as the South for their continual agitation. And when the Civil War came, many Americans, North and South, blamed the abolitionists and also their sort of the Southern counterparts, the fire eaters, these extreme pro-slavery forces who were pro-secessionist forces. So you had these two extremes, abolitionists and fire eaters, and they blamed these two groups for having brought on the conflict. And ultimately, anyway, the issue that brought on the conflict was not the existence of slavery in the United States, which only the abolitionists opposed in all its forms, but rather over the extension of slavery into federal territories. And we'll get to that down the line.